So here we go. And I'm going to share my screen as well so you guys can see. Okay. Do you guys see my screen right here?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So this lecture is going to be about paragraph structures, and back in week 2 or unit 2 rather, we talked more about the general strategy of approaching the writing process as a whole. So you could think of it as, back in Unit 2, we were looking at the forest. Here, we're going to be looking at the trees. Um, so before we spent a lot of time looking at the pre-writing process and basically going through the steps of building a paper. And we really didn't talk a whole lot about the act of writing itself, the drafting phase. And that's what this is going to be all about. And hopefully, I'm going to give you guys a couple good ideas of how you can approach your next paper in this class, because I did keep that in mind quite a bit. Um, so, when it comes to paragraph structuring, the strategies are always going to be the same because we have introductions, we have body paragraphs, and we have conclusions. But the techniques will change as you will see. There's a couple alternatives that I share throughout this lecture, and there's a lot of different ways you can do it. I mean, there's no yeah, there are right and wrong ways to write an effective paragraph, but in general, they're all going to have the same strategy. And for each paragraph type, that introduction, body paragraph, and conclusion, I'm going to give you the general strategy for each of those. And then I'm going to break it down into their simplest form. So sentence one through whatever, right? And then I'm going to give you some tactical considerations. Again, the techniques will differ. So those tactical considerations is what's going to give you more flexibility and creativity as a writer. So let's begin from the beginning, the introduction paragraph. The general strategy behind any introduction that you write is going to be pretty much the same, right? So this class is about exposure to different writing styles, and whether you're writing an expository paper or an argumentative paper or a research paper, the general idea in an introduction, the strategy is always going to be pretty much the same. The first sentence is going to be an engaging hook. Um, you're going to spend the next couple sentences thereafter providing a clear background for the topic, slowly narrowing that scope, and then you're going to present your thesis, quick summary of your main points, very similar to the thesis statement formula that I shared back in Unit 2. And ultimately, the purpose and the strategy behind the introduction is to provide that roadmap. Very important. Now, if we break down introductions into their simplest form, this is what we come up with. This is about the bare bones as we could get when it comes to an introduction. And if you want to take a picture of this, that's perfectly okay. Um, Usually, when you sit down to write a paper, you kind of write the first things that come to mind. And you might have an idea of exactly what you want to talk about, but it helps knowing what that simplest form is. And this kind of goes right back to those key concepts discussed on the previous slide. So, sentence one, you have a general introduction with a creative hook. Sentence two, slowly narrow the scope. Sentence three, you're going to really narrow in on your topic. Sentence four and five, those are that's where we can get a little bit more creativity and variety, because you can talk about rebuttals and alternative angles before you talk about your thesis, what you're actually going to argue or discuss. So that sentences four and five, that's where um, we get some variance. And then, of course, the very last sentence of your introduction should always be your thesis statement. And if you need to revisit that thesis statement formula, you can go back to Unit 2 and check out that slide. So now here's an alternative, right? So this is the one that I share with my students for mostly argumentative essays, but they work quite well for other types of essays as well. And of course, it goes into a little bit more depth. So this, you could think of this as not the simplest form, but a slightly expanded form. And it's a good form or structure to kind of mimic in most papers that you write. So the very first sentence, of course, is the hook sentence. And one thing I'm going to go into the tactical considerations in the next slide, but you always want to avoid a sweepingly broad statement that lacks substance, like from the beginning of time type of thing. It's just a very unoriginal and kind of stale way to start an essay. And I'm going to give you a couple tips on how to kind of avoid that or at least revise it out of your writing. The next two sentences are contextual. So you build the foundation for your topic. Think big picture, but not sweepingly broad again. And then you're going to slowly narrow it down. Um, and I do say in that third bullet point right there, save specific talking points in your strongest evidence for the body paper or for the body paragraphs. That is something to consider, and I'm going to talk about that again on the next slide. An antagonist sentence, so that's acknowledging perspectives or alternatives that may not be something that you agree with, but it's you showing that, hey, I've done my research and I know all the alternatives out there. So it establishes your ethos as a writer. Um, and another antagonist sentence. Uh, this one's a little bit different. So I'm going to go back a slide real quick. So here we talk in sentence 4 and 5, we discuss the angle and perspective you will ultimately take. And then sentence 5, we discuss the alternative angle that maybe you don't agree with. I think that's okay, but when you have a really strong thesis statement, I don't think you need to spend as much time on discussing your perspective until you get to the body paragraphs. And that's why I do have this alternative, right? It's for a stronger rebuttal. So basically, you could think about it as pulling a rubber band back, right? So when you mention opposing arguments, you're pulling that rubber band back and you add another sentence so you get a little bit more tension on it before you release that band and you assertively postulate your thesis statement. And with the thesis statement that I've given you in the previous lecture, it has that built-in rebuttal component. So you could think of that very much as like a slingshot to get your argument going. Now, moving on, we have the tactical considerations. So crafting a hook sentence is very hard. It's tricky. And a lot of times when you are faced with writing an introduction, you have that blank page syndrome where you're just looking and you're like, okay, I got to get something down on the paper. Um, if that's the case, that's perfectly okay. Um, so usually your best hook sentence, if this is something that applies to you, it's going to be your second or third sentence. And you'd be surprised how often I would tell students like, hey, your first, second sentence, sweepingly broad, way too um, outside of the realm of what is meaningful to your topic. But that third sentence would be a perfect hook sentence. Um, so that's something that you would want to catch in the revision process. So when you're making final touches, take a look at that hook sentence and don't be afraid to make that omission and be like, that hook sentence just isn't really doing it for me. But that third sentence, that one would work pretty well. So that's just a tactical consideration, something that you might find quite helpful going forward. And the second one here, show your sources early, but don't go into depth yet. So again, you want to demonstrate that you've done your research, you know what you're talking about. Maybe you could include a citation or two in your introduction, but I really wouldn't go too far into it because that's where your body paragraphs are going to shine. When you include all those extra details and extra nuances to your argument, that's where your body paragraphs can really become more effective. You don't want to put too much into that introduction. You can lose your readers fast if you throw too much at them too soon. The third bullet point, give your opposition a fair voice. In academic writing, especially with controversial issues, or even if we're writing about uh, informative paper, an expository paper, there's always alternative views, controversial views, differing angles and perspectives. And if we do our research and we do our due diligence, then we can talk about all of them, and we can talk about the pros and cons of each. And even if you feel strongly about something, anything, that's perfectly okay. That's perfectly okay. You have an opportunity to voice that in the body paragraphs, but in the introduction, it's only fair to say, you know, so and so has a perspective on this that is supported by these people. And um, in your thesis statement, of course, you can say, nevertheless, here's my perspective, and this is why it's important. Um, but you don't want to present that one-sided argument. You don't want to attack the straw man or anything like that. Bullet point number 4. This is something that a lot of students mistakenly do, and they're called signpost phrases. So it's talking about something before actually saying it. And very commonly in this essay, I'm going to talk about, or this essay will discuss XYZ. The most common trouble spot I see signpost phrases is in the thesis statement. As long as you follow the thesis statement formula from Unit 2, you won't have this problem. But it's just for the sake of concision. It's always better to just jump right into your topic and start discussing it. There is a point, maybe around an essay that's 10 plus pages, where signpost phrases might be more appropriate. The longer the paper, the more appropriate a signpost phrase be, because it does provide direction for a reader. But anything less than, I would say, probably 10 pages, it just doesn't need it. And then your thesis statement formula. This is going to kind of build on that a little bit. It's just a tactical consideration. Again, if it suits your topic, if it suits the style of essay that you're writing, maybe you want to focus more on the past tense, the present tense, or the future tense. Um, but having an idea of how you want to view your topic is pretty important when you start thinking about your body paragraphs. Because if you're stuck in the past tense, everything is based on forensic thinking, what has already happened, um, and that can be useful for a lot of topics. But some style of essays might require you to be more in the present tense, right? So real time observations, what's happening right now. Um, and I think if you pay attention to all of these and give them all some sort of attention in your paper, then you really can't go wrong. What I would avoid, though, is just being stuck in one of them in neglecting the others because they're all important, right? Like past tense, forensic thinking, it's important to know what has happened in the past. That's history. We need to learn from it. Present tense, equally as important. Real time observations. Um, if we're too busy looking at the past or the future, then we don't see what's right in front of us. Of course, that foresight and projecting data of the future tense is really important as well. We got to look towards the future with quite a bit. So that's just tactical considerations. Again, something to keep in mind while you're writing your introductions. And that concludes the introduction paragraph. Moving on to the body paragraphs. Here is the general strategy that we have. So, an effective paragraph develops one main idea through a series of related sentences. That main idea is usually introduced in the first sentence, and it's called the topic sentence. Um, Paragraph is usually 5 to 7 sentences. And a useful way of understanding a paragraph structure is to think of it as a block. So we have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And of course, the paragraph should easily be traced back to the thesis. And that goes back to the point that I was sharing in Unit 2. So if you guys recall how I connected the thesis statement formula to the body paragraphs, that's usually done through the topic sentences. So your X, Y, and Z. Your X would be the topic sentence for that body paragraph. Moving on, we have the body paragraph in its simplest form. And again, 6 to 7 sentences is a pretty ideal length for a body paragraph. You could go longer than that. You could go shorter than that. I'll talk a little bit about that in the tactical considerations for this section. But in general, this is the breakdown of how a body paragraph would look for just about any essay that you'll write in college. So sentence one, that's your topic sentence. That's your X, that's your Y, that's your Z. It directly relates to your thesis statement. Sentence two is your explanation. So in a way, it kind of follows along from your introduction, right? So you have a contextual sentence here. You're basically just explaining why your point is important. Illustration, this is one that has a little bit more creative freedom to it. And I'm going to talk about that in the tactical considerations because there's a lot of ways we can introduce evidence and demonstrate how our points are strong and supported. Explanation of the illustration. That is when so let's say your sentence 3, your illustration is like a direct quote from an author or an outside source. Sentence 4 would be your explanation in your own words of how that quote relates to your main talking point in that paragraph. Sentence 5 is a second illustration and explanation. And again, this is optional. So depending on your topic, depending on the purpose of your essay, 1 to 7 sentences, 8 sentences even, you might have to rinse and repeat this explanation, illustration, explanation of the illustration process. Just depending, it really just depends. But again, this is just in its simplest form. This is the middle of the body paragraph. It's that explanation, illustration cycle. And then ending the body paragraph, you have the transition. And this is kind of important because I do see a lot of students lack transitional statements in body paragraphs. I'll A lot of times students will just abruptly end a paragraph. Sometimes it's a cited sentence that they end the paragraph on, or like a direct quote. And it just feels like the body paragraph falls off a cliff. Like you said everything you said, and now it's just gone. You always want to neatly wrap up your points and transition to the next paragraph. This helps readers follow along and comprehend everything that you're talking about in your paragraphs. And again, sentence six is kind of like uh, it's kind of like a miniature conclusion just for your paragraph. And one of the key points is to relate it again back to that thesis statement and explain how, in the grand scheme or the bigger context of your essay, that this paragraph is important and relevant. Um, and we have a couple other simple strategies that we can follow for body paragraphs. And this is just not limited to the two that I'm going to share on this slide and the next. There are a bunch of different strategies to structure body paragraphs. Again, the idea of them having a beginning, a middle, and an end is always going to be consistent. They're always going to have those main elements that I discussed on the first slide of this section. But this is a pretty simple one that's called the sandwich method, and it just gets you thinking about having that top, that middle, and that bottom. So your topic sentences, that would be the top bun of your sandwich, right? And it introduces your new material. It's your topic sentence. It has the clear connection to the main topic, which is your thesis. And then you have the middle of the sandwich, the meat. That's where you have the meat, the lettuce, tomato, all the good stuff. Supporting sentences, that's your explanations, your illustrations, and your explanations of those illustrations. So that's when you just expand, you provide those details, you support your great ideas. That's what it's all about. You support your great ideas. And then your closing sentence, that's the bottom bun. And again, it's just wrapping up your paragraph, your main points, and connecting it to the next one. And that this is a pretty easy way to think of structuring a body paragraph. It's not completely, it's not as detailed as the previous slide where we break it sentence by sentence. But when you're in the middle of writing a paper, it's good to at least have that visualization of, okay, sandwich method. We're going to have the top, the middle, and the end. And if that's the only thing that sticks in the middle of writing, which, can be a nerve-wracking experience, I totally get it. That's okay, because you have some sort of a structure in mind while you're writing, and that's key. You have to have some sort of cognizance, some sort of self-awareness of where you intend to take your writing before you actually write it. And here's another one. A lot of my firefighters in here know this one, the SOAP method. I've mentioned in past classes before how the SOAP method, typically we as firefighters use it for writing patient care reports. However, it also can apply to body paragraphs. You could think of the subject as your topic sentence. And this is actually really good for writing research papers and even expository papers, because you can introduce your 5 W's, your who, what, how, when, where, why. You can introduce all of that with the SOAP method, and it's a good way to build some deeper context to the kind of papers that require it. So those type of papers where you're informing your readers or describing some sort of process that may take a few paragraphs to get to the gist of. using the SOAP method can be a pretty effective way to do it. So then you have your objective, your how and your what. Your assessment explains the why. That's your examples, evidence, details. And then your at the bottom there, you have your solution statement. You can anticipate and connect to the next paragraph. It's just it's a neat way to apply something that many of us use in the workplace to academic writing that, maybe we never made that connection before, but with a couple tiny tweaks and a little changes to the method, it still applies and we can still use it. And the idea still kind of applies that there's a top, there's the beginning, there's a middle, and there's an end. And it neatly wraps everything up. So moving on, tactical considerations. We have body paragraphs here. And this is probably the most creative aspect of writing. It's how you support your ideas. Because like I said before, there's all those illustrations of evidence. How are you going to support your ideas? What kind of evidence are you going to bring to the table? And sometimes we don't know exactly how to do that, but this is going to give you a couple ideas. So you can use statistics, a great way to quantify your claims. So if you find yourself using like some, most, many, few, general terms like that, you could probably find a statistic on it that has a specific number. So like instead of saying a lot of people die from smoking cigarettes every year, you could find the actual statistic. You could say 430,000 people die each year to cancer related or smoking cigarettes, cancer related to smoking cigarettes, something along those lines. It just is a good way to show that you've done your research. It's a good way to add more substance and detail to your argument, just as all of these will. So using facts, this one's pretty obvious. Don't make generalized statements, right? that seems pretty obvious, but a lot of times when we're in the heat of writing, we forget that um, we're writing for an audience, and maybe they don't agree or don't trust us enough. So what we have to do is validate our claims. And how do we do that? We use citations, we use facts, and we back them up. And we find statistics and using quotes. The third one there is also a really great idea. Um, I do mention that there's no hard and fast rule when it comes to quotes. However, I would say that I wouldn't recommend starting a paragraph with a quote, and I wouldn't recommend ending a paragraph with a quote because that goes against the paragraph structuring ideas that we talked about before. So, very rarely is a quote good enough to replace a topic sentence, and very rarely is a quote good enough to replace a concluding statement for a paragraph. So, as with most of these here, besides the very last one, most of these are only designed really to go in the meat and potatoes of your body paragraph. So sentences 2 through whatever, as long as it's not the first and the last. Using anecdotes, depending on the style and the type of essay that you're writing, this could be a really fun and interesting way. Telling some sort of a story, personal story, or maybe some sort of proverb that you've heard in the past. These little things can add a cool little element to your body paragraphs. They're usually better in introductions and conclusions, but you can use them in body paragraphs as well. Paradox, that's a good way to dismantle opposing perspectives and those alternative angles that we talked about before. Um, just be very careful to avoid making fallacies if you decide to go down the rabbit hole of logic. Um, because even if we say something that seems sound, it doesn't necessarily mean it's valid, and vice versa. Um, so, yes, using paradoxes can be a very effective rhetorical strategy. It could be very good for argumentative essays. Um, but I would just be a little careful with them. And then the last one I have here is using problem statements and questions. This is a good way to reframe old stale topics in new interesting ways. And it's a really interesting way to kind of move conversations in new directions. So, where there was previously a stalemate on maybe alternative perspectives or different pros and cons, you can use this to find a new path. So, for example, um, a pretty good example is instead of asking what is the meaning of life, which is the wrong question, we could ask in what ways can we make our life more meaningful, right? So that has some answers to it. And it's that simple reframing of an old stale question into something new and interesting that can move a conversation in a new direction that previously wasn't available. Um, so that's a pretty good idea and a good tactic to use if you're going to write an argumentative paper, for instance. Um, and moving on here, let's go to the conclusion paragraphs. So here's the strategy. This never really changes for any academic essay that you write. This is basically how it's always going to be. You're going to restate your thesis statement. You're going to summarize your main talking points. You're going to share final thoughts, and you're going to leave a lasting impression. These are the big four main considerations. They should always be present in your conclusion. Um, and it really doesn't matter what kind of essay that you write. It doesn't really matter what your topic is. These should always be there. And here it is broken down into its simplest form. And again, it's very similar to what was on the previous slide. So we're revisiting the thesis, emphasizing the seriousness of our topic. This would be a good spot to talk about solutions. Um, it's not necessary. Again, it's dependent on your topic. Um, but a call for awareness and action is almost always a part of a conclusion. And if we go back to the consideration, the tactical consideration in the introduction about the future tense, right? Somewhere in our paper, we should have some sort of attention towards the future. Well, your conclusion is probably the best place for that because it does leave readers with a final thought and it gives them something to think about, something to act upon potentially in the real world. And that's really what the purpose of writing is, after all, is it's not just to write and inform. Oftentimes it has the purpose of inspiring some sort of change or action in the world. Um, and now moving on, we do have some tactical considerations for conclusions. Signpost phrases should be omitted just as often as students use. In this essay, I will talk about just as often I see in conclusion, comma, and then they go into their conclusion paragraph. You don't need to do that. I would recommend omitting that every single time you write it. Um, It's just not necessary. It's not needed. Unless your paper is 10 plus pages, um, your reader will see that, hey, this is the last paragraph. I'm guessing this is going to be the conclusion. And if they start reading it and it's structured like a conclusion paragraph, then it will be very evident that it is the conclusion. Point number two, avoid introducing new information. This is so important, very overlooked. In a conclusion, it's not a body paragraph, right? You're not adding citations, you're not adding additional evidence. Your illustrations are done, your explanations of those illustrations are done. This is not the time or place to begin talking about further examples, right? This is the time to provide a summary and a synthesis, wrap up your talking points, synthesize it with your thesis statement, right? Bring it all together. Again, don't introduce new information in your conclusion. Now, the third bullet point, this I saved it for this one, but it actually does apply to all the other paragraphs. Maintaining an objective voice, unless you're writing a personal narrative where the topic is very reflective in nature and you're encouraged to use first person pronouns and talk about your experiences. In general, you don't want to use words like I, me, my, you, your, our, we, and phrases like I believe, I think, I feel, in my opinion. All of these should be omitted from the introduction all the way down through the conclusion, especially if you're writing like an argumentative paper or expository paper. These words shift the meaning away from the subject of the sentence. Instead, it shifts it towards how you perceive the subject and the action of your sentence, right? Rather than what it actually is that you're saying. And you'll be surprised. Like if you write a sentence that begins with, I believe, I think, I feel, if you start a sentence with any of those and you go back and you just omit the I believe that part, if you just cut that out, the meaning of your sentence will not change at all. In fact, when you reread it, you'll notice how much stronger and more objective it sounds because you made that little omission. And that's probably one of the best kept secrets of effective college writing is that all you have to do is omit those two words and you change a weak sentence into a strong sentence. Um, and lastly, be concise. So your conclusion, 5 to 7 sentences, very similar to all the other paragraphs that we talked about in this slideshow. You don't want to repeat yourself too much. You don't want to have too much explaining or illustrating. Like I said, at this point, you have talked about all your main talking points. You've already provided the evidence. Now, in the conclusion, is not the time to rehash those old points. Um, at least I mean, it's okay to summarize them, but you don't want to go back into depth and cycle along through that. So that is the end. I know it was a little bit shorter this time than it was in Unit 2, but I feel like I gave you guys some good information on how to structure each and every paragraph. And along with the Unit 2, more systematic. And like I said, we were looking at the trees this time. Before we were looking at the forest. But now you have both perspectives, right? You got the big picture perspective of how to approach the writing process. And now you have the more nuanced details that you can focus on And I think between the two, as long as you keep both of them in perspective and don't focus too much on one or the other, think that you'll have all the tools that you really need to not only be successful in this course, but also your future writing courses. Now I'm going to go ahead and stop the PowerPoint, and if you guys want to ask any questions, feel free to go ahead and ask now. So if you guys don't have any questions right now, that's perfectly okay. You guys can email me or text me, send me a message in the class, um, whatever works for you. Um, and I hope you guys have a great rest of your day. I know it's a beautiful day here. The sun is out and it should be out for a couple more hours. So if you do happen to be off shift or you're not working, definitely go outside and get some sunshine. Alrighty. You guys have a good one.